Welcome to episode 02 of CipherVibe's end-to-end cloud security architecture course. Authorization decides whether an authenticated identity may perform a specific action on a specific resource in a specific context. It is the primary blast radius control for cloud operations. We will connect its purpose, design boundaries, implementation path, failure modes, and evidence of effectiveness. Every cloud security layer relies on the ones around it. Authentication supplies a trustworthy subject, while resource policies, network boundaries, and data classification provide the context needed to make an authorization decision. Logging then proves which policy path was evaluated. Treat the architecture as a chain. A trusted identity requests an action, a policy makes a decision, a workload or data service enforces it, and telemetry records enough context to investigate later. The first building block is model jobs with RBAC. Role-based access control works well when the same job requires the same actions repeatedly. Define roles around business responsibilities, assign through managed groups, and keep privileged or destructive actions separate instead of bundling convenience permissions into broad administrator roles. The second building block is add ABAC for context. Attribute-based access control applies policies using properties such as environment, data class, application owner, device posture, or approved purpose. It scales dynamic cloud estates when tags and identity claims are trustworthy, consistently applied, and audited for drift. The third building block is apply least privilege. Least privilege is a design method. Enumerate required verbs, exact resources, valid conditions, and expected duration. Start with no permission, add only proven needs, and use organization-level boundaries or explicit denies to prevent policy combinations from creating dangerous capability. The fourth building block is elevate only when needed. Just-in-time elevation lets an identity request a privileged role for a bounded reason and duration. Require approval where risk warrants it, record the session, expire the grant automatically, and preserve a monitored emergency path that is not used for routine administration. Use this reference pattern. Begin with an explicit policy that describes the permitted outcome. Enforce that policy at the closest reliable control point. Route decision and activity evidence to protected storage. Then give an accountable team a tested path to review exceptions, correct drift, and respond to violations. A strong authorization design combines role grants for routine work, attributes for dynamic scoping, hard boundaries for non-negotiable risk, and just-in-time elevation for exceptional privilege. Implement this layer in a sequence that preserves evidence and limits blast radius. First, inventory effective permissions and high-impact actions second, define job roles and ownership boundaries third, add attribute conditions for environments and data sensitivity fourth, replace standing privileged grants with timed elevation fifth. Run positive and negative authorization tests before rollout. Prefer pilots with a named owner and rollback plan over an unmeasured organization-wide switch. The best rollout is one where a normal workflow succeeds, an unsafe path fails closed, and the team can explain the decision from logs rather than intuition. Security architecture fails most often through assumptions, not dramatic movie-style attacks. First, confusing assigned permissions with effective permissions after inherited policies combine second, using wildcard actions or resources for convenience third, automating entitlement removal without preserving rare recovery requirements fourth, letting privileged exceptions persist without owners and expiry. A configuration screen is not assurance. Collect evidence that the intended control applies to the correct scope and that violations become visible. First, review effective access rather than policy documents alone second, measure standing administrator and wildcard permission reduction third, test privilege escalation paths and cross-account trust fourth, log approvals, policy decisions. Denied actions and role activation test both normal activity and a safe negative case in an authorized environment. Record the expected decision, the evidence location, the owner who reviews exceptions, and the rollback method. Repeat after platform changes, new integrations, or major shifts in business use. For a practical exercise, create an authorization matrix for a fictional product team with developers, operators, auditors, support staff, and a break glass administrator. Use synthetic information or an environment you own or are explicitly authorized to administer. Deliver a one-page diagram, a concise control statement, a list of expected audit events, and one test for an allowed path plus one test for a denied path. This artifact is more valuable than a screenshot because it explains the reasoning behind the configuration. Before scaling this layer, ask 5 review questions. Which assets, identities, or environments are in scope? Who owns the desired state and exception decisions? Which enforcement point can reliably apply the rule? Which records prove the decision and retain enough context for an investigation? And how can the organization revoke access, contain impact, or roll back safely when a control fails? Good architecture makes these answers explicit and testable. The key lesson is that authorization architecture becomes dependable only when design, policy, enforcement, evidence, and ownership move together. Document the decisions you make, remove permissions and exposure that do not support a real requirement, and rehearse the paths that matter before an incident forces the lesson. Continue through the next episode to connect this control layer to the rest of the CipherVibe cloud security architecture.